we do to help keep spam to a very, very minimum, get rid of it, is we have all the comments moderated. So me and Pharaoh, we kind of go through as quickly as we can and approve them. So if you post a picture and it takes a second to show up, it's just because we got to get in there and moderate it. So thank you for your patience on that. Another question about this week's video was about the diagram placement. So last week I did a whole diagram placement for the leaves. This week I didn't because I quilted some different designs on my flower that we didn't show. So I'm going to leave it up to you to come up with your own placement for that. But trust me, I think you're going to be fine. You're going to do great. All right, so I had no really questions to answer until I got on the text chat, and I've got pages of it. So we have some stuff to go over. So first, let's talk about the pictures and let's see the different designs that we worked with today, or this week. So first up, that flower meander. So what I love about this design is when I've taught this in person, I find that this is one of the easier designs for some quilters to get the hang of. I'm going to troubleshoot a little bit for you if you've been having trouble. But what I love about this particular design is that it just gives a beautiful all-over texture to the quilt. Now, I know I keep saying that in this challenge, but those are the designs I'm picking, nice all-over texture. These are things that you can use whether it's edge to edge over the whole thing or as a filler. If you're going to take the time to learn a design, we might as well make it nice and versatile for you. So with this design, one thing that I really want to iterate or repeat is that the spacing or the size of your petals, those arcs that make up the petal, that's going to determine the density of your design. What that means is it doesn't matter how many echoes you put around it, and it doesn't even matter how big, that flower gets, eventually it's all going to blend in with each other. And so that's kind of freeing and really nice because it takes a little bit of that pressure off, a little bit of that idea that you have to get the right number of times. But I noticed when we were texting, that some people were like, why? Some people found the leaf easier and some people found the flower easier. Why is that, right? Well, I find that in general, quilters tend to gravitate to one of two preferences. So the reason the flower might appeal to some quilters is because it's very methodical in how it goes together. You do step one, you do step two, you do step three, and you continue on, right? The leaf is more my style because it's more do whatever you want, right? You can echo, you can go left, you can go right, you can echo 5 times. Well, sometimes all that choice can be a little bit overwhelming for newer quilters. So these designs are not put in an order of hardest to easiest. I try to actually alternate between those two different kinds of designs. That way, if one week you struggle, the next week you won't. But if you're trying a design and you're like, oh my gosh, why is this so difficult? It could be it just doesn't appeal to you. That does not mean that you can't do it. Absolutely can. I'm just saying you'll kind of gravitate towards those kind of designs. You'll find them a little bit easier. And so the flower meander is very much like that methodical, follow these steps. And sometimes that resonates with quilters a little bit better. All right, so I scoured all my quilts for pictures of like actual quilts I've used these designs on because, I always say it's one thing to know how to quilt a design. That's great. But where are you going to use it and what kind of quilt are you going to put it on? And I'm struggling because all my customer quilts, I would just send them off and I didn't always get pictures. But I did get a picture of this one. This is from years and years ago. This is actually Jackie Gehring's quilt. And it's perfect, this design was just perfect for it because it was a baby quilt. So it was like purple and a little bit of brown and a lot of cream. And she specifically requested something that was feminine, but not feathery. And I'm like, okay, what does that look like? Well, this is what we ended up coming up with, the flower meander. Sometimes you don't want that ornate, overly designed quilt. Sometimes you just want that nice overall texture. And this quilt had linen for the background, which looks amazing when quilted. So pretty fun with that. So all over, whether it's solid fabric, busy fabric, when you just want that nice all over texture. So let's talk about how the design goes together. So I kind of drew out the diagrams. These were in the expanded resources. The first thing I want to talk about is that first swirl, that first little curl. It doesn't need to be really big. And I did get out my whiteboard, so I'll draw this out towards the end. The reason we don't want that swirl very big is because all it's doing is forming the center. We just need something round to start adding our designs off of. And I love it because somebody commented, I find I do better if I close it off and make it a swirl. Absolutely, you could definitely do that. So make it a swirl, or a circle, make it a circle, and then continue on. It doesn't matter if it's opened or closed. And I know Judy had a question about that. I just leave it kind of open because that's just how I do it. But I just make a little curl and then work my way right back out. basically, once I leave that center, I want to be done. I don't want to have to try to work my way back in. And we'll see what that looks like. I did show it in the tutorial, but I'll draw it out too. All you have to do is keep adding more stuff, more echoes or more petals, and it'll be fine. But whenever you're ready to make your next one, right? You're ready to branch off. You're going to stop and you're going to breathe. Take a drink of your piecing potion, relax, whatever you need to do, and then think, where do I want to add my next flower? Right? So in this instance, I wanted to add it on the other side. I could add it anywhere I want. That's what's great about a meander. I can take it anywhere I want. But once I decide where I want to add it, I'm going to add another row of petals just till I get to that point, and then quilt my next little swirl. So I'm using that design to maneuver around, and that's what really makes it ideal for actual quilts. You know, when you're practicing on a piece of fabric, that's great, but when you're on a quilt and you have a defined boundary, you're going to have to learn how to work around and avoid those corners, and so this is going to definitely allow you to do that. Once you make your next little curl nice and small, and I think I said in the video about a quarter size. So a quarter size is just my visual representation. We'll talk about size here in a second. Nice and small so that I can then work my way back around and add my next flower. But here's the thing, once I get ready to run into something else, I'm going to stop and change direction. So as I start building on my flowers, sometimes those row of petals will be just a little arc. They won't go all the way around, and that's okay. I'm just going to go until I run into something else and back up and go the other way. You know what I'm going to say. I say it all the time. We don't want to leave a gap. That's the most important thing. As long as everything is filled in, it's going to be great. And so getting it close but not running over it will definitely achieve that. So as we can see, the petals are somewhat consistent. They don't have to be perfect, but I'm trying to keep them the same size, and there's no gaps in between. Another thing just to point out, you don't have to worry about making that row touch the one before. I know that sounds silly to keep saying, but in classes I've taught, I've noticed that that's a thing. Probably because that's how we used to doodle flowers. We kind of make them touch the row prior. Once I quilt that row of petals and I move on, moved on. I'm not even thinking about the previous one anymore. So sometimes you might find that helpful. Just ignore what you've already done and it'll be fine. And then as you progress and as you go, you start to have that whole overall design. And drawing is a great way to practice the design. It's not to get better at drawing. It's just a way to learn how the design progresses and goes together. It just really helps you kind of get into the thing. All right, so now let's talk about variations. So I know last week it was a little overwhelming. This week I tried to keep it not so overwhelming, but variations are just a way to show you how to take one design and use it in a lot of different ways and hopefully find one that resonates with you. Not every variation is for every person. So this first one is the echoed flower. Now, what's really cool about echoing in any design is anytime we echo something, we're adding like almost a parentheses around it. We're really showing it off and highlighting it. So what we're doing here is after we quilt that first row, we're going to echo our way back and then continue on. Well, what happens when you do that is it kind of puts emphasis on the petals themselves, the unquilted area, and I think it also draws attention to the flower a little bit more as opposed to the overall texture. Now, this is going to take longer, right? Because we're going to have more quilting and we're going to have that echoing. And so I want to make sure that I use this in an area of the quilt that's going to show off. So what would that look like on a quilt? If I had a big quilt that was mostly solids or mostly some, where you could see the quilting, I might do something like that. But if it had some busy borders, a border fabric that was really busy, I'm not going to do that in the border because it takes longer and you can't even tell. So I always like to think of my return on quilting time investment. So definitely in areas you want to show off or in areas you want to distract from somewhere else. So if you think about back to that picture of Jackie's quilt, maybe I would do this in her favorite fabric or maybe in an area that, she really loved. So this is when I want to draw attention somewhere. Another thing I want to point out, and I said this in the video, but it does need to be repeated, there needs to be enough contrast between the size of the petal and your echo line. So I think I use the analogy like if your petal is a half of an inch, you want your echo line to be about a quarter of an inch. The reason is we want it to look like an echo. If they're too close in size, if I had a half-inch petal and a half-inch echoing, it's just going to look like another row of petals that don't quite look like they should. And so if we're going to take the time to echo, let's make it different enough so that it stands out. I want it to look like I meant to do it, whether I did or not, and keeping that spacing different will make it look like you meant to do it. So let's see some different ways that you can use either the echoing or the flower. Now, in the meander, we're doing it all over, right? We're putting it everywhere, adding that beautiful texture, but you definitely don't have to use it that way. You can use it more as a motif. And all I would do is I would just start with my circle and build off of it. We'll see that here in a second. And you can also add echoing. So in this circle block, it was pretty big, and it's tricky quilting big round curves, keeping that curve consistent. Well, adding that pretty flower in there and throwing some leaves around the outside was just a really great option. Now, this is going to help us tiptoe into combining designs, because next week we're going to be doing a little bit more of that. But as you can see, use it like a motif or to draw attention, or put it in the very center of something that you love, center of your quilt, center of your favorite fabric, and you can surround it with different designs. So don't think that you just have to use it as an all over, because that's how we've learned it. It's definitely a beautiful, beautiful motif. I've used this in square blocks. Let's say you have a big patchwork block, you can put that right in the center. I've used it around blocks to draw attention. And what's nice about it is you can sustain, like since it's little arcs, even if it's a long line, it's still nicely broke up. So this picture is not the best, but I had to use it because it was just such a fun quilt. So this was a quilt for Robert Kaufman way back in the day. They had sent it to me to quilt, and I loved the watercolor effect, like how it went lighter to the darker. And at that time, what was really popular was that big swirl. I don't know if anybody remembers that. You start in the center and you do this big swirl, and you do that with your walking foot on your sewing machine. You definitely don't do that with your long arm. It's not fun. I've never done it. I wanted something like that, but I knew I couldn't sustain that, so I did a big flower. And again, the picture isn't the best, but what I did is I had it in the center. I made it a swirl as big as I could, and it got about this big, and I'm like, I can't do it anymore. It's not looking right. And then I started adding my petals and just working my way around. Now, on the long arm, for those of you on the long arm, you know that's a lot of advancing back and forth, but it was a lot easier than doing one big swirl. And I do have a picture of the back, but like I said, this is from a long time ago, so the quality isn't quite there. But you can kind of see that fun overall texture. So I'm gonna take a drink. By the way, this is why I love solid backs on quilts. It's like a two-sided quilt. I know not everybody loves that, but it's fun. All right, so the wavy flower. Now, what I didn't say in the video, which is so funny, you would think this would be easy, right? You'd be like, oh, that's super easy. And some of you might be thinking, yeah, it was. It was very easy. But for those of you that have already played with flowers or quilted flowers, you'll probably find this one more difficult because we're so used to that movement that it's hard to train yourself not to make it. So, but it is a really fun, I'm going to say organic design. I always hate to use that word, but it's very organic. It's very fluid, and it's really fun. So if you're having trouble with getting those points, or you're newer to machine quilting and you're like, I can't, just try a wavy line, right? Just kind of wiggle it out a little bit and then come back. And honestly, if your line gets too smooth, you're just quilting a swirl. So there really is no wrong option here. The most important thing, to make sure there's no gaps in there. Now, this was a sample I quilted while I was filming. So I already have a sample quilted. I already have a quilt quilted, and I have two different samples I'm working on, one on long arm, one on a sewing machine. So I just did this section, and it uses, it has that like a tanny mocha colored thread, so it contrasts just a bit, but I did want to show you what it looks like when the thread color matches. And so here we have that wavy kind of flower. Where would I use this? Novelty quilts, kids quilts, or quilts I need to get done quickly. I think the example, I think I left it in the video, is if I were doing a flower meander over the whole quilt and I got to that busier fabric, then I might switch to this design because it's quicker to do. We're going to talk about speed here in a little bit. A lot of questions about the speed of the machine, but this design is going to go together a lot quicker because there's not as much change in direction. So let's look at the drawings of that. I don't need to make each, I'm going to call it an echo, but it's not really an echo. Each line of my flower, they don't have to echo each other. In fact, it probably looks better if you don't. It's tricky to echo a line that's that wavy, and the harder you try, the harder it is. So just say, you know what, I'm going to make it completely different and call it good. But again, everything is the same. I'm still quilting a little swirl, I'm still adding my wavy line, and as soon as I get ready to run into something else, I'm just going to change direction and continue on. And keeping the spacing consistent is going to be key. I think this could also work for like a ocean-themed quilt because it looks like scallops or seaweed. But I do have an example of this on an actual quilt. So this was one I did during while filming the Midnight Quilt Show. This quilt was crazy because those half square triangles in the center were like that big, and the ones on the were that big. And by the time I got done piecing that quilt, I'm like, oh, this thing, I just want to quilt it and get it over with. And so I used that design, and you can see this is on the back. So even though it's a pretty solid fabric, I know it's ombre, but it wasn't a busy print, but it's just still, it just still felt fun, that kind of curvy to the straight, curvy quilting with the straight blocks. Now, one thing I did to change it up just a bit, because, you know, I like to make things different, is I changed up the size or the spacing between the lines to give it a different scale. So in the center, those lines were a lot closer together, which you can see on the left side. But as I worked my way to the bigger blocks, I made those designs further apart, right? It's not the size of the actual design, it's the spacing between the lines. So by the time I got out here, they were pretty big, and it just kind of helped emphasize that change in size. Changing the scale or the density of a design is a really fun way to draw attention to an area. It's also something we tend to do accidentally when we're learning how to quilt. So this, I'm just kind of using that to my advantage. All right, and another close-up picture. So, you know, not every quilt, I don't use this one all the time. It's not like the swirl that I use a lot or feathers, but every once in a while, you're gonna come across a quilt and you're gonna be like, oh, this is gonna be perfect. So, and when that happens, you'll think about me and you're like, oh my gosh, she was right. So, all right, how about those serpentine flowers? After last week with everybody, you know, being a little overwhelmed, not everybody, with some people being a little overwhelmed with all the designs on the leaves, I almost cut this out, but dang it, it's so pretty. I was like, I'm leaving it in. It has to stay. It's just so cute. It's not difficult, but it does take a little bit more thinking. So for those of you that are newer to machine quilting, start on the flower meander and then progress your way up to this. Or if you're like, heck, I'm gonna go for it, then you can just definitely go for it. We're going to talk through this, and I'm going to draw it out. I had all the step-by-step diagrams, but I took them off since I'm going to draw it. But I will show you a couple of the samples and a couple of the drawings. So fun. I love how when you're changing the size, it kind of helps it squish together, and I'm using the filler to fill in those gaps. And really the hardest part is kind of retraining your brain if you already know how to do feathers. We'll talk about that, because that was a question. Like, you say it's a serpentine line, isn't it like a feather? Kind of, a little different. Not different, the way it goes together is a little different, but it does look so cool on quilts, unexpected and really kind of fun. And where I've used this before is on busier fabrics. So this was a quilt for Tula Pink. She had this beautiful big border, beautiful print with all these little hand gestures. And so I just kind of fit some of those flowers in amongst those elements. Because it's all different, I can stretch it to different sizes and it still looks good. I knew it would work within those weird spots. So here's what's encouraging about that though. Let's say you're on a quilt and you're like, okay, I'm gonna try it. And you try one and you don't like it, just move on. Do your regular flower meander, do anything else, and it's gonna look fine. You don't have to do it over the whole quilt. You don't have to commit to doing it everywhere. You can just throw them in here, throw them in amongst the different things, right? And so even though I would save this for areas of the quilt that you can see, if you're starting out and you're not, you know, you're kind of newer to it, try it in a busier fabric, because when you're done, you're not going to see the quilting anyway. So you can use that kind of as encouragement. So here is a drawing of the flower, and I tried really hard when I was filming to get a really good shot of it. It's so difficult when you have the machine in the way, right? So that's why I like drawing out the designs. But this is the shape that we're going with, and I'm not going to talk too much about it right now because I'm going to draw it out for you just in a second. But we're just kind of creating this serpentine line, and I'm making the ones at the bottom a little smaller and the ones at the top a little bigger. So we'll talk about that here in a second. But using filler, so this is the trick. You can quilt them so that they're all smashed together, but using the filler will help you maneuver around. Since it is a little bit more thinking, using the filler helps me not have to think about one little thing. So, and the filler depends, the filler I pick really depends on how much I want to show off that flower. So if I want to show that off because it looks like I'm proud of it, just like that quilted sample with the gray fabric, I would do dense swirls to really make it pop. But if I just wanted it to blend in, you could see on Tula's stuff, I just did some wavy lines, I did some bigger swirls. They didn't stand out as much as the other one. So you can kind of pick the filler depending on how much you want to show off or hide the particular design. But as I'm quilting my filler, once I'm ready, I'm going to extend out and I'm going to make my next flower. This is the part that a lot of quilters struggle with because we're scared to quilt out into that area, right? It's like there's empty space, especially in a in-person class setting, because I think people are scared to like quilt out and then you'll be out there and people can see it. It's easier to keep it close. You can kind of hide it. So you have to get comfortable extending out, and you want to put it in an area you have some room. can definitely fit it in those irregular areas. Let's not try that right off the bat, but once you get comfortable with it, you can definitely do it. And this is just another example. So these are on a much bigger scale than the other, like the gray sample that I showed you, and they're kind of closer together. They're just kind of filling in that area a little bit more spread out. Same design, just a slightly different effect. But then you could tell by the time I got to the other side, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna put some filler because I can't think about where these are going anymore. So that is a fun design. But I did pull together, just for River's request, my whiteboard. So I'm going to draw through some of the designs, and we're going to draw through them, and then I'll come back and answer a lot of questions that came up. But let's talk about, first of all, troubleshooting the flower meander, just the basic one. So if you remember, I talked about keeping that swirl nice and small. I just need something round to add my petals around and work my way back. So something like this. The reason I don't want it too long is if I'm making my petals, you know, that 1/2 inch size, what's going to happen is I'm going to get something that looks like this. There's nothing wrong with that. It just means that as I come back around, I'm going to be like, I don't know, do I just keep going? I would just keep going until you can't go anymore, and then bring it out. It's just a little bit easier if you start with it round, because then you just kind of get used to going around that. It's not the end of the world if you do this. It looks great. And if you do it once, you can do it all the time. But keeping it nice and round will definitely make that a little bit easier. And just like one of the people mentioned, you could start with your circle and just do your shape. That's not always going to work because, you know, sometimes you'll run into other stuff, but it can definitely, if that helps you kind of mentally know where to go, you can do that. And I'll say, if you leave this big enough, then you have that kind of unquilted area that will pop off of there. Really, do whatever you want, just make sure you do it all the time so that it looks intentional. All right, so there's that one. All right, let's talk about the serpentine line, or the serpentine flower. So the reason I say it's not like a feather, yes, it is the same kind of shape, right? So if we were looking at a feather, which I know we did a live chat on, this is kind of a feather shape that we're working with. We have our spine, we have our petals, that's the shape we have. What I'm not necessarily doing a shape like this, I'm doing one that kind of swoops in. And you can be like, well, that looks really similar. Well, yeah, that's true. It's a little different. All right, so let's break that down. So when I start my serpentine flower, I'm going to quilt my shape, and it's going to look like this, right? So almost like a question mark, like WTF, why am I doing this? Might be what you're thinking at that point. If this is where I'm starting and this is where I end, wherever that is, that's going to be the center of my flower. So that's just where all the lines are going to come back to ish. Don't have to land on it perfect. It's fine if it doesn't. Just get it close and move on. Now I'm going to take that same shape, that same question mark, except I'm just going to quilt it, kind of angle it out a little bit, right? Because I don't want to go right over the line. Angle it out. You don't have to make that movement, but it's kind of fun. And then I'm going to quilt it so that it runs into that other one. So I want it to touch. Wherever it touches, I don't care, because remember, it's wonky, it's different. And then I'm going to backtrack. So backtracking over the highest point, just because I want to make sure I can swoop out. But if I did it up here, it'd be fine too. And another question mark. That sounds better than serpentine line, don't we think? I'm going to start saying question mark because it sounds less daunting. So I don't have the spine of a feather, and the shape is a little different. But the only thing I'm doing a little bit different, and you don't have to do this, is as I get to the other side, I'm going to start making them a little bit shorter. Why? I don't know. I'm just super easily amused. I think it's fun. But you don't have to do that. All right, but the question was, what about the last one? So there we go. So as I'm quilting them, they're kind of in groups of 2, right? I'm going out and I'm coming back. Well, that means I can't always ensure that I end up in the center or the outside. It always changes depending on what's going on. And I think I ended up over here. Whenever I do my last one, I kind of want to help it. I kind of want to help it hook in and touch that very first one. I want to close that off. Now it doesn't always work that way. Let's pretend, hopefully that makes sense, but now let's pretend that I didn't quilt that yet. Let's pretend I was coming from here and I kind of go like that and I miss my starting point. Well, you know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to travel over and kind of hook in there. So I just want to close it off however it happens. So that's how I'm quilting the flower. And if I end up on the outside, great, because that's where I need to move on. If I end up on the inside, I'm just going to travel along one of my lines and then move on. So that's kind of how the shape goes together. It's one of those that as you're quilting, it might be easier to pause and use your finger to kind of trace out where you want to go next and then kind of work your way on it. even like as I'm quilting on a sewing machine versus a long arm, I still have to kind of get used to that different movement. So if you have to think about it, it's okay. You don't have to go super fast. You can kind of create that shape. Now, if you're quilting it and you're like, I don't know, it just seems like a lot of things to think about, you don't have to add this curve right here, that question mark. It could be more straight, you know, and that's fine. It looks very similar. The only difference, I like that little bit of curve. I just think it looks cool, but that's just my opinion. So that's the basic shape we're going with. And then, like I said, I'm using my filler to maneuver around until I'm like, oh, you know what? Okay, I've got my breath back. I've calmed down. My next one is going to go out and extend out there, and that's where my next flower is going to go. So just kind of branching off like that. And I'm sorry the lines are so wiggly, but I'm kind of drawing across my body, but it's just really fun. And again, I end in the center, so I might come out and kind of hit that one. And that means that some of them might have too little things. That's fine. They don't have to all be the same exact size. That's why I like to quilt them all in different sizes. And I think I said that in the video, but it probably I didn't explain it very well. Quilting them all different sizes hides the mistakes, because who's to say it wasn't supposed to look that way? If they're all perfectly shaped and perfectly round, if one isn't, it's going to look pretty noticeable. So I want it to look intentional, even if it's not. So hopefully that kind of clarifies a few things. Before I take this off and come back, I want to talk real quick about the Leafy Meander. And I got a lot of questions to answer, so don't worry. All right. Judy asked, is the Leafy Meander supposed to be closed or open? I think that was Flora Meander, so I already answered that. The question was, why is it tricky for some of you to do that Leafy Meander? Sorry, I'm all over the place. Well, there's a couple of reasons why some people struggle. So if you remember from a week ago, here's our leaf shape, right? And then we're going to echo it. And then when we're ready, we're just going to quilt it in a different direction. The reason that some quilters find this tricky is because first we have a mirror image. For whatever reason that is, our brains can tend to struggle with that when you quilt it and then flip it and quilt it and flip it. So it's kind of like if you see a design that's like ribbon candy, that's a perfect example. That one is a mirror image. That's trickier for most quilters. Not everybody, but some. If you're having trouble with this idea of reversing sides, first of all, you can be reassured it doesn't have to be symmetrical. If it's like that, it's fine. It's going to be great. And the echoes don't even have to perfectly follow it. We just want something that's pointy at one side and rounder in the middle, and then moving on. That's just going to make it look like a leaf. And it was kind of funny because some people were like, oh, I'm struggling with that point. Mine looked like Paisley's. Well, that's why I showed that variation, because points can be tricky. You can just leave it out. I think a Paisley looks just as nice. I think one of the questions came through on the Facebook group. Mine are kind of like part leaves, part Paisleys. Perfect. It's going to look fine, right? So this is like my handwriting style. Doesn't mean that yours has to be exactly the same. I mean, if you think about how we all write our A's, right? I write my capital A for Angela, all big and round. I don't do a pointy A. That's all right. If you did pointy A, that's great. So don't get too caught up in the idea like, oh, it doesn't look like someone else's, because it's your own style. It's your own handwriting, your own quilting style. So another thing that some quilters find tricky about the Leafy Meander is the point. I think I already said that. If you're having trouble with that point, sometimes pausing for a second and then coming back down will give you that sharp point, but also just kind of coming up and back down. And we've seen points last week and this week, so I know you're probably like, enough already, which lucky for you, next week we'll have no points. But as I'm coming in and out of a point, the sharper, the more fluid I make that change of direction, the better my point's going to look. So try not to get too worried. It will definitely work itself out with practice, and I think that's the struggling thing or hard thing for a lot of quilters when I'm texting or typing like practice, practice, practice. Well, unfortunately, some of the stuff does take practice. And then also going in different directions, forcing yourself to go in all different directions. But if you give yourself a routine to follow, I'm going to go left, and then I'm going to go right, I'm going to go up, I'm going to go right. Just whatever that routine is, that will help get you going in different directions. So hopefully that helps. I know that you're like, I just want to hear the good answer, right? Tell me the trick. Well, there are tricks, but it does come down to practice. So anyway, whether you want to try the flower meander or you want to try the serpentine flower, they're all really fun designs to use on your quilt, depending on where you're at and where you are with your quilting skill levels and the quilts that you're working on. Let's talk about a couple of questions. So let's see. Okay, speed. That was a big question. Okay, so some people were like, oh, I'm having trouble getting those points down. And I should have said this in the video. Anytime you have a design with a change in direction, and look at the flower, right? There's a lot of changing directions. You're gonna have to go slower. Because it's like, think about driving a car. If I go in a straight line, I can go faster than if I have to make all these turns. But as I'm moving, I want to get some kind of momentum down. Now, it's different for everybody, different speed for everybody. I can't even tell you what speed to set on because it's up to you. Like it's such an individual preference. But if you can use some kind of momentum to help you go, it will really help you flow right into the next one. And so I think I use it like a ping pong ball bouncing in and out. I don't want to hang out too much in those points without stopping because I can get thread buildup. That can tend to happen. So as I'm moving, I'm just trying to kind of keep that. I know I keep doing this like it's going to help, but it makes me think it's going to make more sense. I know it doesn't, but momentum is key. And so on a long arm, this is especially the case because on a long arm, you have so much more fluid movement as opposed to a sewing machine, right? That quilt doesn't just run away from you. You're not like, oh, come back here. But the long arm, you're kind of controlling this machine, and it's not heavy, but you do need to control the momentum. So don't be afraid to use your body to help kind of quilt with you. That's why I call this design the booty shaker, because as you're quilting, sometimes you get going, your whole body is moving and your booty starts moving too. So that's probably TMI, but don't be afraid to use your whole body. I think sometimes when we're going, it's like trying to use our fingers, use your arms, kind of, I mean, we're not putting yourself like, you know, in a situation where your back is hurting, but basically using your body to help with that. It's kind of the opposite of doing geometric quilting. If I want to do a straight line without a ruler, I'm just going to move my arms. I'm going to keep my body really still and just try to keep, I don't want any fluidity, or I want that to move in one direction. So hopefully that helps make sense. Speed is going to be determined on your preferences. You're going too slow if you can critique the job you're doing while you're doing it, but you definitely don't want to be out of control. So you're going to just keep going. You're going to find that sweet spot. And it's really going to help. And I think somebody said, I need to find a song or some music. Definitely, if you can find something that's in the same, movement for you, that definitely will help. So I love Vicky Hammett said she finds that she's quilting her designs too small. Well, too small is such a relative term, right? Like, I like quilting my stuff to death. I'm sure I'm fine with it. But if you notice that you're having trouble making it one size or the other, try not to worry about it. We're learning how to quilt the shape right now, right? We're learning the design. Once you learn it, then you can start shrinking it or making it bigger depending on what you want, right? So if it goes all the way back to when we learned how to write, when we were writing our letters, our teacher wasn't making us, keep them all very similar, but now we can. Once you learn it, then you can really kind of refine it and make it bigger or smaller. So everybody has a natural tendency. Some people quilt big, some people quilt small. Just try to hang out wherever you feel comfortable, and then eventually you can stretch it and make it bigger and smaller. One thing that can definitely help with that is to, if you want to keep it consistent, like my tendency is I start one size and I change as I go, is keep something next to you as a visual reference so you can kind of always go back and forth, whether it's a drawing or whether it's like an actual, like a quarter size or something in real life that you can compare it to. And Marcia said that her comment just broke my heart a little bit. She said that she's feeling bummed about her wood grain after seeing everybody else's pictures. Well, it's a thing, right? Comparison is the thief of joy. If you've ever been at Quilt Guild and get ready to do show and tell, and of course the person in front of you is the one that spent years doing her quilt, and it was one that got the blue ribbon at the show, and you're like, oh, I should have went first. But you can't compare it to other people's stuff, right? Be inspired, but don't be intimidated. And I know it's easy to say, we've all done it, we're all human. But if you look at your quilt and you're like, man, I'm proud of this, you should be proud of it whether other people are doing different stuff. We're all on this journey, we're just in different parts. So I know that's very pie in the sky, but just trust me on that one. And there was a question, I was supposed to draw it and I forgot. What happens if you break thread in the middle of a flower? Not that it was her, why would I even ask that? Cracked up at that. So if I run out of thread anywhere, or my thread breaks, and I'm in the middle of a design, of course, it's never, when I'm finished. What I'll do is I'll cut the thread, I'll fix it up, and then I overlap my line of quilting by about 1/2 inch. So I'll start my new line of quilting 1/2 inch back. I take a few stitches to kind of tie it off, and then my line of quilting will kind of cover that and kind of help secure it. If it seems a little loose, you can always put fray check on it. The only time it's a little bit different is if I'm really close to like that point. Let's say it's one of those petals and I'm really close to, you know, a good transition. I might just kind of take it out to that point and then go off. But most of the time I just overlap it. So that's kind of how I handle it. Would love to hear everybody else's comments on it too. You can leave a comment in there and kind of tell us how you handle it when your thread breaks mid design. Of course, no fair, you can't say drink more wine. That's just a given. I'm just talking about, you know, technically how you handle it. So I'm going to pop over real quick to see if there's any questions in there. Glad that everybody is having fun. Good. Okay, Marcia said, you may have answered this, but did you start in the middle of the section? I hadn't answered that. I tend to start on an edge. I think it's just from long arming. I started long arming first. So in that section, I start on an edge because think about it. As I fill in an area, if I just transfer right into the next one, it's just going to be on the edge there. You can start in the center. You can start anywhere you want. So if it was a bigger quilt, I might just start in the center. But if I'm filling in a defined section, I usually start on an edge because that's where I like to hide my start and stop. In that seam or in that fake seam of the panel, it's going to be a little bit more hidden at that point. So Julie, calling it a question mark really helped. Isn't it crazy? There is a word for it. I can't remember it now, but basically it's something. Anyway, if you can relate it to something you already know, it clicks. So fun, right? The wishbone, I totally got that when I imagined it as a sideways cursive L. Once I had that, I was like, oh, no problem, no problem. Diane, when do I work towards me and when do I work away from me? Well, in general, it just depends on where I'm going and where I've been. If I'm doing wood grain, I'm going to be doing both, right? I'm going to go back and forth. But what's great about the flower is it's a defined kind of shape, so I'm kind of like filling it in here. There's really no rhyme or reason. I do try to remember to work, which way? Away from me when I'm filming, because you can see a little bit more out there, but you can start anyway. There's no rhyme or reason to it. Yes, just don't stick your finger under the needle. Absolutely. Darlene said she's really late, but it's fine. This will be on there afterwards. You can watch it even if it's not live. Anyway, so I hope that this chat has helped clarify some things, but if nothing else, just remember, as long as you fill in that whole area, it's going to look fine. That's really the secret to it. And when you boil it all down to that, it kind of sounds like, well, dang, that's really easy, right? So just keep going. The hard part is trusting me on that when you're quilting a couple of flowers and you're like, this doesn't look good. I don't know what she's talking about. I promise. Once you fill everything in, you step back, you're like, oh, okay, it looks fine. Because your eyes don't know where to look. They just see the whole overall texture. So, forgot to say, reminder, we have a giveaway every week. This week's winner was Sherry Jewell, so congratulations, Sherry. Already emailed her. And this week's giveaway is for a Flora and Foliage Fat Quarter Bundle. So I'm just sticking with the Flora and Foliage theme since that's our Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. So all the coordinating prints that go with the panel themselves, so great practice pieces, or you might see these again on an upcoming episode of the Midnight Quilter. Well, everybody, thanks for spending another afternoon with me, another half an hour, 40 minutes listening to me chat. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments for sure. I get on there every once in a while and definitely check those. And if you like the video or the challenge, I hope you'll give the video a thumbs up because that really helps YouTube know that you like it and helps it refer it to other quilters. So I'll be back next week where we'll talk about pebbles, yay, or circles, whichever one sounds less intimidating, and we'll talk about how to combine designs and use them to make things pop. So have a great and safe week, and I'll see you soon. Until then, happy quilting.